Hello, my name is Christine Reich, and I am the Jane and Payson Swafield Chief Learning Officer at the Museum of Science in Boston. I am so delighted to converse with all of you today as we dig deeper into this critical question of how do we know if we are making a difference? To start off our conversation, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Eric Jensen, who is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick in the UK and co-founder of the Institute for Methods Innovation. He'll be framing our conversation by introducing us to the idea of evidence-based science communication. So, Eric, I would love for you to start our conversation.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to be starting us off with a presentation, but I've pasted a link into the chat where you can see the kind of resources about evidence-based science communication, which is the topic that I'm going to be discussing here. And just stalling while my PowerPoint comes up. So, all right. So, evidence-based science communication, the reason that I'm talking about this in a session on are we making a difference and how do we know we're making a difference is because this is about the kind of rationale for what is the point of evaluating. Of course, all of us can find ourselves doing evaluation at times because it's required by the funder or for any number of reasons, but the best reason to be checking and testing for are we making a difference is so that we can make a difference, so that we can identify if things are going wrong, and we can also see the pathways to doing things better in science communication. So I'm just going to briefly introduce my background so you know where I'm coming from on this. I'm a social scientist, an applied social scientist, and I work primarily in the area of impact evaluation of science communication, but I also have an academic hat that I still wear 20% of the time, where I teach on media audiences and social change and social research methods. This is relevant to the presentation that I come at this from a few different angles. So one is an academic kind of background, so where I'm acting as a social scientist. I also do a lot of work with policymakers in different countries around impact evaluation of science communication and evidence-based science communication. And then I spend a lot of time as a practitioner, basically as a consultant, working in evaluation and in kind of science communication strategy. So that's the background. And I also wanted to preface this by saying that while we're focusing on basic science here, science communication and public engagement around basic science, of course, we're living in a context that is very much colored by the present and the role of the COVID pandemic. The fact that this is an online conference is already kind of indicating that there's something that's changed in communication more generally. And we should keep that, we kind of have to bear that in mind even when we're focusing not on such an applied topic as coronavirus communication. Okay, so basically the argument that I want to develop is that the future of public engagement with basic science, but also science communication more generally, is evidence-based. And by evidence-based, I mean that evidence is used, whether it's theory that's been developed with the benefit of evidence, or whether it's just research findings, that these are used as the basis for deciding what's working and why, basically answering questions like, are we making a difference? And that doing so, that this should not be a kind of tick box exercise, that we should take it seriously. So when evaluations identify practices that are not working very effectively, that we're looking for ways to improve them, that this is kind of an active search for doing things better than we've done them in the past, and so that the field can advance. And this requires a kind of integration of research and practice at the level of the various challenges that are faced in science communication. So that includes things like social and cultural inclusion, addressing social inequality. So some of the empirical studies that I've done and published show that there are major issues in science communication and public engagement with research around social inequality. That if you look empirically at the audiences who are participating, they're disproportionately those who are kind of already in privileged positions. And this is something that we need to know, and this is something that evaluation can help us to understand not only what kind of problems we have in this area, but also can help to identify ways we can do things better. And this is an argument that I've been developing for well over a decade. So this is a paper from more than 10 years ago that I did with Emily Dawson, where we argued that the need to collect demographic data should not be optional in things like science communication, in public engagement, that it's important to understand the profile of participants and to look seriously at what kind of social inclusion issues are highlighted by that kind of data. We also need to be looking at existing good models for what works in communication more generally. So for example, the theory of planned behavior is a really well-developed theory. If a engagement activity is targeting behavior, then this is something that the practice of science communication should be aware of and should be integrating a good theoretical model for why we think things will work. So this is basically a matter of connecting our ideas about what we want to do and what we want to achieve with our communication and aligning it to audiences. And this is something that evaluation is really essential for. It's also important to go into science communication, public engagement with an openness to learn and change and do things better. So it takes a level of humility and acknowledging that we are not probably going to get things right the first time, the second time, but we can keep getting better over time, just as we keep improving knowledge over time. And that evaluation evidence provides us with an excellent way to see how we can improve practice, how we can improve our impact over time, and that if we rely on evaluation evidence as opposed to the other options, things like counting how many people attend, things like ticket sales, like feeling like things worked well, so having the impression or seeing a lot of smiling faces or other things, if we rely on those, we can get false signals about what's working and why. It's also important, evidence and evaluation are important for clarifying how we can be more efficient in the use of science communication resources so that they're delivering the best value and impact that they can given the resources available. So to put a kind of fine point on this, I wanted to boil down some kind of key do's and don'ts from an evidence-based science communication perspective to just exemplify what this looks like in kind of very unvarnished terms. So I'm using this romper room framing of do be and don't be to soften my message here a little bit. But just to start out with a few don'ts. So don't trust your gut. So I've seen many times in many contexts where very experienced science communication professionals, when they're relying only on their gut instincts, can get things really wrong. Their assumptions can be way off, and they can be off for a very long time if you don't have good evidence that can point you in the direction of where things need to be improved. Don't be a kind of we do this because we've always done it kind of science communicator. So evidence-based science communication approach is one where you're open to changing, you're adapting, you're looking at how both context and your target audiences are evolving, and you're adapting accordingly. Don't be somebody focusing just on your personal preferences for how you like to do science communication or how your institution normally does it, but instead be focusing on what is likely to work and be effective for the kinds of audiences you're trying to reach. So on the do-be front, the do first seek to understand and then to be understood. So this is the kind of classic audience analysis role of evaluation, is clarifying who is your audience, what are their needs and interests, and then targeting the approach to communication accordingly. And then there's also the factor of using evidence to boost social inclusion. So if you have a clear understanding of who you are and are not reaching, and what the kind of differential impacts also of an intervention is on people from different backgrounds, this gives you a really strong starting point for identifying how you can enhance the social inclusion of a science communication activity. Do be clear on where you're going. So have a clear understanding of what success looks like, and be able to articulate to yourself and to others what that outcome looks like. Be clear about what the destination is, but also it's important to understand the steps that you need to take to get there. So a lot of times I encounter big leaps between the kind of end goals, which sometimes are really vaguely framed, and the kind of specific steps that one particular science communication intervention or program can deliver to get you to that outcome. So this brings us to the underpinning role of evaluation. So basically, my argument is that evaluation can be an underpinning factor for good science communication. So ideally, science communication is planned and developed with the best available evidence as a starting point, as I mentioned, with good theoretical models also. And then we use evaluation to adjust, to adapt, to refine our approaches in order to be more effective. So that's why I see it as so important to understand what's working, are we making a difference, but also are we making a difference for everybody and in the ways that we're intending. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you so much, John, for framing the conversation. Oh, sorry. Thanks so much, Eric, for framing the conversation. It gives us a really good starting point for our discussion today. And this idea of what does it mean to do evidence-based science communication? And I really appreciate your be's and don't be's and kind of that way of thinking about our approach. As we go deeper into the conversation, we have 3 panelists with us today who are each representing different aspects of science communication. So Dr. John Besley is the Ellis Brandt Professor of Public Relations in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences at Michigan State University. Ms. Sylvia Leathem is the Education and Public Engagement Manager at IFORM, Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre on Advanced Manufacturing. And Dr. Karen Peterman is the founder and lead evaluator and researcher of Karen Peterman Consulting. Welcome, all of you. I'm so excited to have this kind of researcher, evaluator, practitioner perspective. Some of us wear all of those hats all the time. And so it's great to have this discussion by thinking about all those different vantage points. So John, I would love for you to kind of start off our panel discussion and just give some reflections on Eric's framing.
Yeah, and of course, I think I agree with Eric on most of the points. I'm we're sort of fellow travelers in this sort of sense of like would love more evidence-based communication, and of course, some of our work is in that space. I guess the thing that I wonder about is the degree to which the challenge is convincing people that we need evidence-based communication versus trying to figure out how to help them do evidence-based communication. Either because, so sometimes I think there's people who think they're doing evidence-based communication and aren't. And there's some who would love to do evidence-based communication, but don't have the resources, don't have the skills to do it. And so I wonder, and so that's, I guess it's self-serving in a sense. A lot of our work's been like, well, my work with Anthony Dudo and with Karen and with others is thinking about like, what are the short-term specific objectives, what you call steps that you could prioritize on the way to achieving your larger goals. And so I guess it's a sort of a hypothesis that is, if people had more familiarity, and this is very much a learning sort of mode, with the various outcomes that we often talk about in evaluation. Obviously everybody, and there's a question here about give specific examples of don't trust your gut. The most common trusting gut thing is that if I increase knowledge, it'll change people's behavior, right? That seems to be the default gut move that people make. But there's our work is about lots of other objectives. Like if you're interested in building trust, well, that means trustworthiness. That means maybe you do things to communicate, to figure out if somebody's honest and caring and willing to listen and competent. And that might be, the scientist trying to learn that about others, or it might be a scientist trying to make sure that people know about them and can make correct judgments about them. Like you talked about, it could mean things in the theory of planned behavior. So you want to sort of make sure that people have a sense of risks and benefits, have opportunity to hear about risks and benefits or social norms, or do something about self-efficacy. But I really do wonder about this go back to the core question are we at the point where we need to convince people to do evidence-based communication, or are we at the point of trying to figure out how do we help people create structures, create opportunities for people to do the evidence-based communication? I think there's a real demand right now to do it. It's just hard.
Oh, John, you've given us so many good questions to come back to. Sylvia, I want to give you a moment to kind of reflect on Eric's talk before we move forward.
Thank you, Christine. And thanks, Eric. Very interesting. I'm coming at this primarily as a practitioner. So I would not consider myself an academic or a researcher. I am a manager of public engagement in a research center. So my job is to ensure that my research team, it's about 100 people, that they do their public engagement and that I support them in that and make sure that they're trained. And I run programs for them to get involved in, and I also get the funding for those, and then evaluate those programs as well. So it's great to be even like on this panel as a practitioner, because sometimes as a practitioner you don't get invited to conferences. So I think it's great that the organizers of this one made sure to have that balance, and that comes to something that Eric was referring to as well, that the gap that's there between researchers and practitioners, that is there in the majority of cases, I would say. And I think if that could be addressed or solved, I think we would be going a long way towards having or moving towards evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based public engagement. I did want to raise one issue, which is maybe the sting in the tail of those bees, and that is the issue of when you do get negative results from an evaluation, or not even negative, it could be that your intervention shows minimal change. I was reading a paper the other day that said that people, if you ask them at the beginning and at the end, so if you ask them at the beginning, they tend to overestimate their knowledge, and they don't necessarily report accurately on their behaviors or attitudes. So then at the end, when you ask them the same questions, it might seem like nothing has really happened. So who's going to be the brave person to show their funder that their intervention had minimal impact? So that's maybe something that we could come back to. But I do think evaluation is a great way of clarifying your goals. John referred to goals there as well, that what you are trying to attain, and is that thing attainable and is it measurable?
This is fantastic, Sylvia. Again, you're giving us some things to come back to around incorporating negative results, reporting on negative results, and defining goals. Before we move forward, I think it'd be great for Karen to say a few things, particularly someone who's both a researcher and an evaluator and working in these multiple domains.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, it's funny. So I do evaluation, I do research, but I think of myself as a practitioner too. And somebody who's always trying to think through methods in particular and how to use smarter, better, more authentic methods, especially in informal learning spaces, and especially when it comes to science communication, which sometimes is a very brief interaction. And so one thing I'd love to maybe talk about, if there's time later, is how we define impact evaluation and how different that looks in different contexts. So if you are at a festival and you're at a booth for 5 minutes, or you're at an exhibit for 5 minutes, that's very different than if you have a long-term engagement around a particular science communication topic. And so thinking through what realistic expectations are for what impact looks like, or maybe even maybe if it's 5 minutes, it's not impact. Maybe you're looking for something else. So thinking through what realistic expectations are in relation to the level of engagement or the level of interaction, I think is maybe something to consider and revisit. One of the things I really appreciated about Eric's comments is, so I've been doing evaluation for, I don't know, around 20 years. And one thing that is more and more true is that I think that we've all become more critical consumers of the literature that is available to us. So we're contributing to it, we're thinking critically about it, we're trying to apply it in different ways. And I think that's true both on the programmatic side and on the evaluation side, and we still have a lot of room to grow. So that don't be about like, don't trust your gut. The number of programs that I'm asked to evaluate, even still, that are based on intuition instead of on literature is still pretty high. And then it's really difficult to think about what is that through line from the literature that helped you design the program to the methods we chose to study it, to how we think about if we're going to try to make a contribution to the literature around that topic and what that looks like. And so I think there is a lot of room for us to grow, and that as a field, we've gotten better at doing that. The last thing I wanted to say, I haven't had the chance to work with a lot of basic scientists in their projects, but I do a lot of work with natural scientists. And this whole idea, well, I think all social sciences may be terrifying in some ways to natural scientists, and the opposite is probably also true. And so part of what I like about a framing in relation to project side or science side, and then social science side or evaluation side, is that there's a fantastic area in the middle to kind of think and play together, and to realize that these are really messy spaces. And it's very difficult to do rigorous evaluation in an informal learning context, especially, that doesn't completely wreck the environment that those science communicators created in the first place. And so trying to come up with rigorous and creative solutions that give you meaningful data is something that I think is a really fun challenge about this space, but something that a basic scientist or a natural scientist probably doesn't want to take on all on their own. And so, find a friend. Think about that messy middle in between where your expertise is and what you want to learn and think about and apply, and then work in that space together and think together in that space. I think that's a really rich area for all of us to think about taking some of Eric's recommendations and moving forward.
I love that, the kind of the mix between rigorous and creative, and finding a friend as being important that can help you push the boundaries of your work. That kind of brings us back to this question that John asked all of us in the beginning. I would love for those in the audience to fill it in too with your own thoughts around, what does this look like in practice? And what are those barriers to getting there? There's, of course, having the motivation and wanting to seek it out, as John put in the chat, but sometimes you can also start doing it before you're even kind of motivated or know that this is the direction you want to go, and that can feed itself. So what are those barriers? What are those enablers? What are those steps that John talked about that can help getting us closer to evidence-based science communication?
I might jump in on this one because I wrote my whole thesis about these barriers to evaluation. So I did a little study of people like me in Ireland, public engagement managers in research centres, and what their whole approach to evaluation is. And a lot of it was looking at what the barriers were. I mean, there's definitely, the motivation is there 100%. I don't think there's any question. If you talk to any practitioner, like they do want to move in that direction, and they know. And also the likes of myself as managers, we're getting pressure from funders to produce good evaluation as well. So it is coming. It's on everybody's agenda. But there, then when you get down to the reality of the day to day, I mean, Christine, you were just saying, you could already be started doing a project. And things are, messy, as Karen said. And, often like one of the big barriers for myself and my colleagues would be time. There's not enough hours in the day. It's it is a time consuming process. You also need to think about it, like you need the headspace as well. And also there is a lack of expertise, like Karen mentioned, that dynamic between or the dichotomy maybe between like natural scientists and social scientists. Certainly, like what I see is that a lot of people who are doing public engagement, they are scientists primarily. That's their background. That's what they know. They know quantitative measures. They like data. But the public engagement role, I would argue, is really a social science one. And for that, it's slightly different skill set. A lot of like scientists that I know wouldn't know or be very comfortable with qualitative methods at all. But for doing evaluation, qualitative methods are very, very valuable, and you can gain a lot of really key insights through it. So time, expertise, and then like funding, I'd say, and being allowed the space to do the evaluation, the bandwidth to do it, and then maybe having that safe space that if the evaluation comes back negative or no change, it's not going to jeopardize your funding the next year.
This theme seems to be coming up around funder expectations. It's an interesting one. It seems, in some ways, it seems to enable evidence-based science communication practice, because sometimes the funders are asking for evaluations. They're asking you to ground your practices in research. Someone in the chat mentioned that sometimes funders want to see high numbers, and that's what they're looking for as kind of the soul for impact, or that because the funder is asking for that evaluation, as you're saying, Sylvia, people might be shy around those negative results. And just wondering thoughts from others in the panel around how that funder dynamic, how can we better use it as an enabler of evidence-based science communication practices and engage them in the conversation? John?
Sorry, because I know Sylvia's funder. I've worked with them quite a bit. So I thought maybe I could come in briefly on that, because I actually delivered evaluation training for the relevant team directly, and done a lot of evaluations for them. And I've encountered this with other funders as well, where they think that they're giving out the message of like, do really rigorous evaluation, tell us what's working or what's not. We're absolutely not going to punish you for it. We encourage it. It looks good to us. So they think that's the message they're sending. And then when I talk to the people on the other end of the funding, they think that they have to be super careful about what they tell the funder. They have to create this curated vision of perfection to the funder. So there does seem to be a fundamental miscommunication or lack of kind of shared understanding, at least in the countries where I've had that kind of contact with both sides. I assume it's the case in the US as well. So it might be that we need some kind of dialogue, some kind of forum where these kind of things can be aired more clearly.
That's great. And, tied to this question around funders, one of the chats saying, and people are agreeing, that people just want to see those numbers come in. And this poses the question of what does success look like? And who gets to define success? And does the public get to play a role in defining success? Is it just the funder? Is it the science communication practitioners, the researchers? How do we negotiate that? Because in order to be studying and evaluating, we have to have agreed upon measures around what does success look like in the end? Where are we trying to go? So I wonder if people have thoughts about how we have those conversations around success and where we're headed. I'll let any of you take it.
So Karen, did you want to go first? So yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I think, so going back to the original question, I think one of the big things is the evidence base isn't as good as we maybe think it is. I think we have to, underlying all of this is we have to recognize that the science communication researchers, people like me, have not produced a lot of evidence that is super easy to use. The research isn't super clear. It's not applied. There's an emphasis on, ironically, doing basic communication research rather than doing applied communication research that helps people do it. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, then how do we? I'm blanking, Christine, now on the original question. Sorry.
What does success look like?
Oh.
And do practitioners and researchers and evaluators and funders all have the shared definition of success?
Yeah, so there's no, and this goes back to there's no reason to assume that the buyers of the research know what success looks like. They're probably not experts on what good communication is either. And so I put a thing in the text, like it's part of a communication researcher's, part of an evaluator's job is to help people identify what good outcomes are, and not just and of course there's going to be pushback and it's not going to be short-term sort of thing, but we do need to do that. And then and Karen's point about, it really depends on the project. Like at the end of the day, I would argue most of us have behaviors we want. We want to see people support our science. We want to see people support science in general. We want to see people make better health decisions or better environmental decisions, or there's behaviors we want down the road. And this is the steps thing that Eric talked about, right? But then then you have to sort of walk it back. Like, well, what in the short term, what are some things that would get us there? If it's a festival thing, maybe it's just they have a good experience. We're not trying to do something broad and just want them to have like one good experience. If it's a long-term relationship building, maybe it's people build sort of a mutual sense of whether or not people are honest or caring or competent or have integrity. Again, this is where theory thinks. And if we're trying to change behavior, maybe it's we change social norms. Maybe it's we change senses of self-efficacy or behavior or some other element of behavioral control. But that's where the theory comes in. Theory has all these rich concepts that are ultimately outcomes. They're ultimately short-term dependent variables that if we make smart communication choices, we can affect. And the two-way thing, super important. I will emphasize those effects can be on the scientist too, right? A scientist can change their sense of self-efficacy. A scientist can change their sense of what norms are. Scientists can change all their own beliefs, feelings, how they frame things, all those things too. But yeah.
And Eric, you're bringing up this point around vagueness and lack of realism. Do you want to kind of elucidate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I was mentioning that there are kind of two major issues that I see when most often I'm arriving kind of as an evaluation consultant after there have already been decisions made about what are our goals. They've probably already gotten it funded with those vague goals. And then we are facing the challenge of like, okay, how can we actually measure this? And if we leave those goals alone at that super vague level, then we would have a terrible evaluation design, because then it would be the kind of bad questions that I often see in evaluations, like, did you learn today? Yes or no? This kind of thing. If you don't get into the specifics of what exactly do you mean by you want them to learn something about science, then it'll be kept at such a vague level that it's not going to provide any meaningful measurement at all. So that's the most common problem I see in this area. But there is a more subtle issue that I've confronted most extensively in my work on biodiversity conservation, which is the tendency to define impact in excessively individualistic terms. So to talk about behavior changes in like personal shopping behavior choices when what's really needed is changes to the system. And there are mechanisms that public engagement institutions have, for example, to apply pressure directly to manufacturers or to go for things like marine protected areas. There's been a number of successful campaigns to get these kinds of major changes that are long-term, that are permanent. And so there needs to be some kind of calibration of like, sometimes it seems too big and institutions don't want to kind of pick their little tiny piece of that huge problem to address, but it's important to kind of face up to the nature of the challenge and to see where can we make the biggest difference in this really big challenge.
There's one comment here that I think is important about what's the role of the public in defining success, and how do we bring them into this conversation where we might think it's successful, but perhaps the audience that we're choosing to serve don't view it as a successful experience. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I am glad you circled back to that. I think that there is an opportunity well before evaluation to even decide what the science communication should be. And so we often, I think part of the exclusion that Eric talked about is that, and this comes back to the intuition maybe sometimes too, is that we think we know what the primary or the priority populations that we're trying to work with want and need, but we don't necessarily bother to ask. And we don't do that in relation to program design in a lot of cases or in relation to evaluation. So it's perfectly legitimate to ask early and often and get advice from the priority populations that you're trying to work with as part of an engagement. And then to use that in how you think about defining success along the way. So that may not be your only success metric. You may need something in addition to that, but those I think are really important qualitative data. They also speak to the process of what you're trying to do and being really intentional about the choices that you're making, and then using that as an indicator of success. And so thinking about what your process is, that's one of my biggest cheats for getting around what some people might think about as negative findings. A lot of the research that I do is based on process. Like here's this thing we don't understand a lot about. Let's figure something out about this thing. And then as long as we do work on that thing, we win. Whether it's a negative finding, whether it's a positive finding, we're still contributing to what we understand about that evaluation topic, about the use of that method, about what does and does not seem to work around a particular communication strategy. And so if it's framed in relation to working in this really messy space and trying to understand how to do better work in this really messy space, anything you learn is a win if it's about the communication piece itself. And so that I think is a slightly different way to think about communicating with funders and thinking about how you frame the work that you do from the very beginning.
That's great. And I love that idea of anything that you learn is a win. And it brings to mind for me a question that's in the Q&A window that I'm going to publish around times when this person brings up an experience where they presented scientific data to the public and the public said, yeah, of course we knew that, right? Because it's something that was known for people locally, but wasn't known for scientists. And this question is around whether that ever happens with science communication research, where you end up codifying something that educators have already operationalized. And I know I have certainly done that in the past, and sometimes it can be a powerful tool. And I'm wondering if others have found that, that there's ways in which practitioners can help yield insights into new future research directions that maybe we hadn't thought about before.
I mean, that's usually a criticism of social science in general, is that a lot of the things that we show are, but I still think there's some value in, here's the evidence that this works. And especially when you get to the tactical level, I think so, the theory level up there, but the tactical, like this thing, sitting down in a room with people will make a difference, and here's evidence that it made a difference. And so finding those tactics, and really, I mean, this is where we go back to the need for applied research. There's lots of things we could do, lots of activities we could do, showing that it has an effect so that somebody can then go to their funder and say, you know, the evidence says it has an effect. I mean, I think there's lots of little bits that work needs doing.
Yeah, I mean, the argument that I remember from my intro to methods course back during my undergrad was, yeah, a lot of the findings are going to be obvious, but a lot of things we think are obvious are not actually true, in particularly in the space when we're dealing with humans, where what people say does not necessarily match what they will actually do. And so you have to be, it's very tricky to get around some of these challenges in measurement and in establishing what's actually working and why. So it is important to actually check whether something's having an impact. Is it going as we think it is? Just because, I mean, I very often have seen the scenario where smiling, happy faces lull practitioners into a false sense of security that everything's going great. And then when I actually dig into what's going on, it's kind of completely surprising. That's one of the great things about audience research and evaluation, is that there's a lot to learn, and you can't just predict automatically exactly what you're going to be finding.
So another one around that, there's this idea that's coming up again in the Q&A around how realistic is science learning in short, informal engagements? A question that is always coming up in the minds of practitioners, researchers, evaluators in that space. You know, this person is proposing that assessing changes in attitudes, dispositions, identities might be different than learning. Some of us think it's an aspect of learning. So I'm just wondering what this group thinks around the evidence around how do we set realistic expectations for what can happen in a short, informal learning engagement.
I'll just a quick comment, and I think maybe Karen might be best placed to answer that because she does a lot in that space. But for myself as a practitioner, I probably wouldn't even attempt to measure something if it was going to be very fleeting. You know, I would have to pick and choose the programs that I want to evaluate, and I would focus on something where there is a longer term engagement. But I know there is a big body of work out there on festivals and, you know, shorter term engagement, or you know, other informal learning and things like that.
Karen, do you want to take a stab at providing some insights there on things that you've learned over time?
What can I say that's fast? We're running out of time. So we, one of the things that we did in some festival evaluation work years ago is think about, you know, what's our unit of analysis? What are we trying to understand about the experience of being at a science festival? Do we want to know that if we sum across all of the individual booths, or as many as we can gather data on, that those were engaging, that the quality of what was provided was good? And so we played around with using a really short engagement scale that we could apply to specific experiences people had just had. But that was about the experience. It wasn't about an outcome. It's not something we would call impact evaluation. It is evaluation, but it's not impact evaluation. So thinking about what we mean about that word impact and when it's appropriate to use it, and when you're actually doing a different kind of evaluation that might be equally important, but is not impact, is something I think to consider in when you're making the choices and how you're making the choices about what to lean into in different kinds of evaluation settings and different contexts.
That is a perfect way to end our session. Thank you all so much for this really rich discussion. I learned a ton, and I hope all of you participating out there did as well. Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.